Bonjour, bienvenue. I'm John Kirton. I'm the director of the G7 Research Group, a global network of scholars, students, professionals centered at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Canada. We've been analyzing the G7 Summit, been at every one since they were in Toronto in 1988. And on the basis of all that work, we have some firm views about the performance of the Apulia Summit starting today, just getting underway. I predict that the Apulia Summit will produce a strong performance, one of the best ever in the 50-year history of regular G7 summitry going back to 1975. Apulia's strong performance will be led by its very strong performance on its signature issue, support for Ukraine in the face of the aggression by the Russian Federation, which continues to this day, to this hour as we speak. And we've already seen the first big step forward on that file, the agreement by G7 leaders to loan Ukraine another $50 billion, this from the interest in the coming years on the Russian assets that they have seized, which amount to about $300 billion. And I'm confident that we'll see much more by way of direct financial and military support for Ukraine to come. On the next issue, the existential one that G7 leaders, the people, everyone confronts, climate change, clean energy, and the environment, I think we'll see at least a significant performance led by the G7 finally agreeing to kill killer coal, its production, its demand, its use, its financing in all G7 countries, including Japan, by a much more rapid date than they had previously agreed, trying to keep up with the scary science brought home to everyone by the deadly extreme weather events happening almost every day. Greece, Florida, it is today. Africa, a significant performance there when this G7 will take Italy's Matai plan and have it become a G7 Matai plan, moving towards a genuine partnership between the G7 and leading African countries. And of the major components of that, the first one is clean energy, so it will contribute to the climate change clean energy priority that Prime Minister Maloney has set from the very beginning of her presidency, in fact, more than half a year before. Food security, substantial advances there. We remember, of course, the big step forward at the last summit Italy hosted, actually a few ago, L'Aquila, where a large number of guest leaders were invited, and on the final day, much more money raised for food security, which has been rolling out ever since. Artificial intelligence, here building on last year's Hiroshima AI process, but now with a big boost from His Holiness Pope Francis, transforming the approach into ethical AI, not just safety for human privacy, but can it bring gender equality, for example, everywhere? AI for health, AI for climate change. We'll have to wait and see how much of that they do. A development, I think, we'll see solid advances, largely through the more recent emphasis on public-private partnership blended finance. It was much easier back in 2005, the Great Glen Eagles Summit, when you just had to count up how much official development assistance governments, G7 governments and their taxpayers were getting out their wallets to put on, or purses to put on the table, and now it's a much more complex configuration. But we do have the Global Partnership for Infrastructure Investment of the G7, and we'll see that, I think, mobilized in this quest too. The Indo-Pacific region, another priority. I think we'll see solid advances there, but will it be enough to assure the people of a democratic Taiwan that their future will be secure? And many members of the G7 have not become full Indo-Pacific powers, so they'll need to step up even more, as they've started to do, to make it not just an American responsibility, with a little help from Japan, but upon all of the G7. Migration and refugees, a very top-line, tricky political problem now in all G7 countries, including Canada, which has long been a lonely voice arguing, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, that immigrants are good for the receiving countries, in fact essential, and that's now true for all G7 countries as they suffer labor shortages in the USA and in Europe as they're getting older, right, and need to look to their future, and it's the immigrants who bring in the young of the next generation. The economy, part of the built-in agenda, but actually things are all looking pretty good for growth, led by the USA, but a little bit better in some other G7 countries than the International Monetary Fund thought it was even a few months ago. And I'm sure Joe Biden will mention the latest inflation figures in the United States headline. 0! That war has been won, and just in time. To quote Ronald Reagan, is it easier for you to buy things at the stores? Oh yes, Americans can say, and it probably will be on as they go to the polls on November 5th. Finally, an issue which has come up strongly and may be competing with Ukraine is the dominant security issue here, the Middle East. And here, I'm predicting there will only be a small performance. Mr. Biden and his Biden peace plan will not bring peace to the Middle East, or even a serious step forward here at this summit or in the coming weeks. But good work will be done on humanitarian relief for the starving, suffering people in Gaza. Joe Biden got off to a good start. $404 million that he promised just the other days. Others will chip in. So I think for the immediate, very real human crisis, this summit will make things a little better for a little while, but it will be a long time before we actually get the outcome we want, with all parties to the existing conflict agreeing that we need a two-party, two states in the region, and not just one which they control. Thank you.
And who's next?
Now over to Ella.
Hi everyone, my name is Ella Kokotsis and I'm the Director of Accountability for the G7 Research Group at the University of Toronto. And I just wanted to start by saying thank you, first of all, to Italy. I was at my first G7 summit in 1994 back in Naples. So this marks my 30-year anniversary of working alongside Professor Kirton and Madeleine Koch and the rest of the team covering summits, and it's been an absolute delight. Now, I wanted to just not repeat much of what Professor Kirton has already touched on in terms of energy and climate, but just dig a little bit deeper, and I won't take too long, on emphasizing a couple of expectations around climate and energy security at this summit, particularly as we consider the 50-year anniversary of the G7 summit. We can't forget that the G7 was really born after the first oil shock, and energy was such an important issue leading to the birth of the G7, and here we are 50 years later, and climate change, of course, and energy security are still top of mind for the leaders as they meet here in Borgo Ignacia. So just in terms of expectations, what can we really expect on these issues coming out of the summit? First, the G7 has already set from last year ambitious targets to phase out unabated coal-fired generation by the early 2030s. We've seen strong language of that, and what I expect is that we're going to see a reiteration of those commitments. We didn't get exact timelines for certain G7 countries, so there may be a push to emphasize that in this particular communique. Second, Italy's presidency will likely push for increased investments in renewable energy sources, particularly in wind and in solar power. And this again aligns with not only Italy's, but the rest of the G7's focus on eliminating fossil fuel consumption and transitioning to a greener energy future. Third, I suspect that economic security will be coupled with energy security, including strategies to diversify our energy sources, particularly given the geopolitical situation that we're currently seeing in Ukraine and across the Middle East. And because climate issues are really so cross-cutting and transcend so many issues that are on the G7's agenda this year, I suspect that there is going to be focus on broader development issues in Africa that foster climate resilience. And this again is tied to the Italian presidency's Mattei plan. And finally, as Professor Kirton noted, references to AI and climate solution, I suspect, will be on the leaders' agenda for the first time ever. And this is really an opportunity to further discuss how AI innovations can further improve things like energy efficiency and can help us understand better how severe climate events can be tracked, monitored, and hopefully mitigated before they happen. So on that note, I'm going to conclude my remarks there and pass the mic over to my colleague, Jessica Rapson. Thank you.
Yeah, just briefly. So my name's Jess. I'm a senior researcher with the G7 research group. Like my colleagues have said, it's important to not just track what leaders say they'll do at summit, but whether or not they actually follow up on those promises in the year after the summit. So all the work they've done has been to track that, and we've done this since the first G7 summit in 1975. So all this data means we can have a really good model to predict empirically how well these members will perform at the Apulia Summit. So there's a machine learning model that uses a variety of economic and political variables that can predict whether each commitment made at these summits will actually be fulfilled by the leaders. So given that, we predict pretty high performance for the UK and the EU this year. We predict high performance for Italy, but low relative to the other G7 members, as is historic for Italy. We predict lowest performance or following through with commitments made on gender, but we predict really high following through with commitments made for international cooperation, artificial intelligence, and social policy. We also predict that a change of party in the French National Assembly will probably result in a lower ability for France to meet the obligations it makes this week. And we also predict that the U.S. election, regardless of outcome, will probably increase how the U.S.